Thanks again for joining us at the 2023 Sloan Sports Analytics Conference Competitive Advantage Talks presented by Kager. My name's Anna Yee, and I'm a first-year MIT Sloan student. It's my pleasure to introduce the presentation, Winning Speed Skating Medals Through Pareto Gains. Please join me in welcoming Ingmar Jungnickel, Chair of Sports Science Commission at US Speedskating, to the stage.
It's said that a good team is better than the sum of its parts. A great team is made out of accomplished individuals that achieve yet even more together. How do you beat the best team in the world? A team that not only holds a world record in the discipline, but where the individual athletes have another 10 world records combined between them. I want to tell today the story of how the US Speedskating team went from underdog to topping the medal table at the World Cup, winning an Olympic medal, breaking the world record, and changing how the sport is executed along the way. I want to put specific focus on the elements that you can also apply in your sport or your business setting. So to give you an idea what we were up against, in the Netherlands, speed skating is a national treasure. If you go to any random person in the street in the Netherlands, most of them can tell you their favorite athlete and the results of the last big race. The sport is televised. There's a national pro circuit that supports multiple professional teams. And there's scores of scientists studying speed skating at universities. The difference between our team best performance and the Dutch world record performance was 6.5 seconds. In a 3.5-minute event in international competition, this is an eternity. So we knew we couldn't win just by trying harder. We needed a method. We needed a new innovation. And the first insight that led to all of this was that in the long run, excellence is not about how good you are. It is about how fast you get better. The winner of the first Boston Marathon ran a time that, if you look at it corrected for today's distances, was 3 hours and 7 minutes. Today, you wouldn't even qualify for the amateur event with a time like this. We also like to think that all the big gains were in the past, and now it's all just tiny differences and everything is so close together. But I graphed the differences in speed, or the speed increase over the last 100 years for 3 different sports. And you can see that pretty consistently, everybody is still linearly getting faster. So if you're not improving 0.5% every year, no matter how good you are, you will eventually fall behind. So with that in mind, we knew we needed to shift our focus onto rate of improvement and about being innovative. And I work in the cycling industry in my main job. And the prevailing high-performance mindset there is one of marginal gains. It was invented or spearheaded by Sir Dave Brailsford from the Team GB, Team Sky, and now Team Ineos. And the idea here is that if you put enough tiny gains together, you can end up with a sizable competitive advantage. I also live in the Silicon Valley, where there the obsession is all about disruption, and the idea that a tiny startup can outcompete a much bigger resource team by getting one major thing right. And we adapted this concept to the sports background, and we dubbed it Pareto Gains after the Pareto principle, which states that 80% of your effect comes from only 20% of the causes. So our idea was to identify this one single major Pareto gain, the one big thing that we could implement, and then laser focus on executing this well. And we believe this works really well for 2 specific reasons, or for 2 specific aspects in the implementation flow. In both cases, for marginal gains and for Pareto gains, you have to come up with large amounts of ideas. But the differences start when you have to evaluate them. See, if you know your stats, evaluating a tiny difference is actually a lot harder than evaluating a big difference. You need much larger sample size and you need more specific tools. So evaluating a large amounts of marginal gains, what happens often in reality is that the things don't get really evaluated all the way through. You get a lot of false positives, and you get a lot of systems that might not have the final impact, making it all the way to the team and to the execution, which then means that you might be overloading your support staff, expecting them and your team, expecting them to do 12+ changes each year. And if you want to pull off a marginal gains kind of strategy, you have to be extremely operationally skilled, and you have to have very large resources. And even then, I would argue that it's easy to lose focus on the big things that matter. If you compare that with a Pareto Gains joke, that they're really easy to measure, they're really easy to pick up, because you can see them with the naked eye, because the differences are so large. If you're not sure if you found a Pareto gain, you haven't found a Pareto gain. And once it gets to the execution stage, you task your team with only implementing one major gain and implementing this perfectly, not with pushing 30 of these gains towards the team. So this might be an obvious idea to say, okay, yeah, of course we want large gains. We want as many large gains as possible, but where can we find those gains? And the important part there is where not to find them. In every sport and in every business, there are these things that are known to matter, and teams have invested years into honing these skills further. If there were any major gains in those spaces left, you would have already found them. So one important aspect is you have to look somewhere new. You have to look in places you haven't looked before. A second element out of this is that when a novel idea is being proposed that turns out to later be a Pareto idea, the first reaction is typically, this is out of scope. That's not how you're supposed to do this. That these ideas have something that is weird about them. And that's often a promising sign, because an intuitive idea that isn't weird is something that people are much more open to considering. And if you realize that the main reason an idea hasn't been done before was a social custom, or was because the other teams don't do it this way, or it could look weird in public, or it takes courage to try, that is a promising direction. But not all weird ideas are good ideas. Most of them are probably just weird ideas. So there's another condition that is really important to all of this, and that is looking at the first principles. If you want to find an idea that makes a multi-percentage point difference to your competitive performance, you can only look in certain places. If the whole thing, the whole subcomponent makes only a fraction of a percentage difference, you won't find a Pareto gain there. And if you analyze your sport about what really matters, you often find that there are elements that you've not looked at before, that you haven't focused on, that makes up this Pareto difference, this 80% difference. In speed skating, actually the numbers work out quite well. As the name suggests, speed skaters are very focused on ice and sliding friction. It's in the name. Athletes talk about whether the ice was fast this day or the ice was slow today. They spend significant effort honing their blades. And the speed skate is the symbol of the sport, right? But if you look at where the drag actually goes, where your power actually goes, 82% of the resistance speed skaters face is aerodynamic resistance. And it turns out that that was also the area where the last two Pareto gains in that sport was found. When in 1974, a middle-aged architect from Switzerland showed up at international speed skating competitions wearing skin-tight clothing, he was ridiculed. When 2 years later, he skated to an 8th place at the Olympic Games, people recognized that the skin suits, as they came to be known, really worked as a performance technology, and they were universally adopted. The next change was also aerodynamics, and it had to do with how aerodynamic active fabrics could trip the boundary layer from laminar to turbulent and lead to another reduction, for example, on the upper arm of 80% in drag in idealized conditions. And so this showed this method of looking at these major elements and looking at places you hadn't looked before. So putting this together and looking at it for the team pursuit, we looked at many different ideas, and one thing rose to the top. In the team pursuit, the reason athletes can work better together and can skate faster than they can as an individual is drafting. By skating behind a different athlete, you can save between 20 and 50% of power, which also means that the lead athlete has to do the hardest work and has to work significantly harder. And the way work is typically shared is by changing out the leader. It turns out that this is not a particularly effective way of doing this, because at every exchange, you have two people in the wind. You have two people in this high drag first position, and you have nobody in this lowest drag third position where they can draft behind two people. At every exchange, you lose some distance. And the power demands fluctuate heavily, whether you're in first or in third position. If you've ever done interval training, you know that running and then walking is significantly harder than just running a medium pace all the way through. So this is a very similar thing. And then another really big part that might not be as intuitive around this is the inefficiencies in navigating to make sure that every athlete's tank is empty at the end of the race. With exchanges, the speed is determined by the leader's power, and the leader can either choose to speed up, slow down, or go to the back and end their pull at the front. For a variety of reasons, this can only be done in the turns. So the lead athlete always has to choose if they want to do yet another half lap or pull off at this point. And they have to account for how much energy they have left in their tank and to estimate how much energy is left in their other teammates' tanks. If they get it wrong in the sense that they're working too hard, what often happens in international competition, and what is quite dramatic, is that the lead athlete goes to the back, a new, fresher athlete comes in, picks up the pace. The former lead athlete had spent too much energy, doesn't manage to catch on to the back of the train, and the train leaves without him, and the race is instantly lost. So it's critical for this lead athlete to actually be conservative in estimating the power. But then as they get to the end of the race and they have energy left, maybe in third position, there's nothing they can do with this extra energy to contribute to the team. So we came up with a new method, and that was inspired from bump drafting in car racing. And the idea was that the leader never changes. And instead of sharing energy by sharing the time up front, energy would be shared by pushing the athlete in front of you. And the reason this works is that the athletes are always in line and close behind. You never have these exchanges where you have the very aerodynamic position of the train being left. And the speed doesn't only depend on how fast the first skater pushes. If the skater in third position has extra energy, they can support the skaters in front of them just by pushing harder. And so every athlete can make sure that when they get to the finish line, they've given their all. So that idea was presented among a large amount of different ideas. We built a computer model to evaluate it. And the model coupled the bioenergetics element of these varying forces. It coupled the energy demands of being in first, second, third position with an aerodynamics model that was able to present and measure these different drafting elements. We fed it with the data from our team and with competing teams, and we corrected it for changes in air density and environmental conditions so we could make sure we could compare the data from our athletes who skate a lot at Salt Lake City at altitude with lower air density to, for example, the Dutch team that skates more at sea level. And the model was able to predict performance both for our individual athletes and for the team. And what the data showed was that the new method was 2.5% more efficient than the old method. If we go back to one of the slides at the beginning, which said that the 6.5-second gap between us and the Dutch team was a 3% gap. So now we had closed 2.5% of this 3% gain. And this led to a lot of downstream effects to the team. Suddenly, the team felt they had a secret weapon. They had a chance of building the top team in the world. Everybody focused and committed to this one change and this one technique. And the US team trained harder and better at this new approach than any other team in the world. And to this day, they're the best executing team in this one discipline and in this new technique by executing this new style. The best athletes wanted to join the team pursuit team because it showed that this was our biggest chance at winning medals. And it led to us going to the World Cup, going to the events after the pandemic, and breaking the world record on home soil. Yeah, breaking the world record, winning again 2 more times, going to the Olympics, skating an Olympic record time that was yet again beaten by a Russian team, and we got a bronze medal at the Olympics, beaten by 2 teams that also adapted the new technology, and ahead of the Dutch team, which was the one team not to adapt the new approach at this time. Now, a couple of years later, the sport has changed, and not a single team is executing any other technique than the American push technique. Meanwhile, we are focused at looking at the next major Pareto gain. Thank you.
We can answer any questions. We'll bring the mic around. Just raise your hand.
Hi, great talk. I guess my question is, so, I'm sure you guys did lots of, modeling, right? CFD type modeling. You can prove it theoretically works, but from the time that you introduced this to the athletes to when they were actually able to implement it and approach like those theoretical gains, how long a process was that? And was there, any kind of resistance, pushback, right, from the athletes
Yes.
in the process?
Great question. So we came up with that model. Here's kind of the timeline. We came up with that model in February. We introduced it to the program director. And in April, and then in June, we introduced it to the athletes. What really helped is that we had a good relationship with the team from before already. We were able to implement some of the different changes before. And then personal relationships with the athletes. I mentioned my day job is actually in cycling. I'm not actually a speed skating expert by background. I'm a cycling expert. Turns out most speed skaters train cycling during summer, and I'm a halfway decent cyclist to be able to keep up with them. And it turns out just going, the way we introduced this was actually on the cycling team camp after a day of riding with them. And it helped a lot to know that you could relate to the athletes. They could see I was an athlete. They could respect the work that was done already in that sport. And it helped tremendously with the idea. At first, it was more the, not the top athletes that were interested in this, because they could see that being their ticket of going to the Olympics. And at the first debut, after we got a 5th place with a team with suboptimal execution and a very young and inexperienced team, it became clear that it worked, and suddenly all the top athletes wanted to be on that team.
I was wondering if there was any new strength work that they had to do to start pushing with their arms more versus the typical force needed being their legs. Like, did they change their workouts or have to change in what way they gain strength?
Yes, great question. So we adapted the whole training program around this new technique. And this goes back to what I think the strength of the Pareto principle and the Pareto Gains is getting anything to execute well has a ton of downstream effects. You have to execute a new training program. You have to have new strength training. You have to change your mind around, wait, now I need to push athletes. Now I need to consider these elements in my training techniques. They had to become extremely coordinated as a team on how they would set their blades, because the blades are pretty long, and if you overlap blades, you fall. And so the short answer is yes, basically it affected every element of the training. And because of these big downstream effects, we think this technique works so well to only focus on one big change and executing it all the way.
Thank you for this presentation. Really interesting concepts here. Do you think the strongest skater would be at the end, anchoring, or would he be at the front?
Yes, so there's some details of the model we're still trying to keep to ourselves in some of the aspect. Actually, when the talk came up, one of the interesting conversations was which parts can we share, which parts can't we not go too deep into. Yeah, and I think I'll leave it at that.
Do you imagine that this American push technique will be a core part of the sport for years to come, or do you imagine there might be a scenario where the next Pareto gain could be found in completely scrapping this idea and adopting a new one? Or is it just so much, so the advantages are so embedded in this technique that you think it's here to stay?
I think that's a great question. People are definitely not going back to the old technique. You cannot compete anymore in the old technique, and every team has adopted this one. Whether there's an even better technique that could be done, I think I'd be in a bad spot saying, we got to look outside the box, we got to be open to new ideas, and saying, no, it can't be done, there can't be anything. So for sure, we are looking if there's something even better and even bigger. At the same time, and this connects also to that part in the speech, is typically the next big gain is not an incrementation of the last big gain. It is something completely random and different and looking in a different direction. So my guess would be, like the comparison is the Fosbury flop, is like the jump technique, is that this technique will stay around for a while, but there will be new Pareto gains, and there will be new massive gains, and they will be in an area where you're surprised that nobody has even looked before.
Hi. So I can't help but make the link back to cycling and the Peloton. There seems to be very sort of tangential aspects here, and there's like teams that break away off the Peloton. How do you think cycling will begin to adopt strategies like these? Have they already? And if not, why not?
Yeah, thank you for leading this over to cycling. I actually mentioned I work in the cycling industry, and I've actually worked with professional cycling teams for most of my years. I'm actually much more versed in the cycling world than the speed skating world. So we've been doing a lot of that work in cycling already. And in some ways, this is actually an adoption from the modeling work that we had done in the cycling world already to speed skating. So yes, a lot of this is already happening.
We have one more question here.
Thanks for the talk. This was really, really fascinating. I'm curious, were there other techniques you tried that you thought were going to be the next Pareto gain that didn't work? And if so, what was your criteria for scrapping those and switching to the one that was ultimately successful?
Yeah. So we evaluated probably 50 ideas or something like this. So a very large number. Most of them were not like team pursuit drafting. So it was, the whole idea is that it was the whole spectrum across nutrition, skin suits, apparel, training techniques, everything. And the criterion was, can you show with napkin math or reasonable thing that there is a multi-percentage gain that you can see getting there. And so we found a couple of these multi-percentage gains, or things that had a chance of being a multi-percentage gain. And we scrapped everything else. We focused on those elements. And then one of those rose to the top, partially on ability to execute it, partially that it was just the most proven, and partially because it was the thing we had the most buy-in on the team. And some of those are in our backlog and hopefully will be seen at competition in the future.
I think that's all the time we have. Please give one more round of applause to Ingmar. Thank you.
Thank you.